start on time, just to be sure we can fit everything in. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Sherri Rodgers-Conti, and I'm the director of Southeast CASA. And this is Dana Schmidt, director of the Yankton Community Library. And we approached the library about partnering with us on this book. To set the stage for the book, it's been probably 3 or 4 years. It has to be 4 because it was before COVID, that I was trained as an ACEs presenter, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. And through that, I learned so much about, we all know that traumatic experiences are bad for a person. Nobody wants anybody to have a trauma in their life. And positive experiences are good for you. We all know that. Anybody who's, been a child or has a child or knows a child knows that. But the ACEs training really taught a lot about brain development and how those traumas impact the brain. So since that time, I've been trying to get other people to be interested in this stuff and to care about it as much as I do it. I wanted to get a community coalition going and all this stuff and give presentations, and that anytime I gave one, it kind of turned into this, wah, 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 scientific, boring stuff. And it was like frustrating to me, because I just think it's groundbreaking and it answers a lot of questions. So, as you can see, a book came out, and if you'll notice that one of the authors is Oprah Winfrey, I immediately thought, this is going to help raise awareness about how important all of this stuff is. And I happened to watch a 60 Minutes show where Oprah interviewed Dr. Perry, and it was like, yes, I'm just like cheering in my living room, because they were talking about the same exact things that I think everybody needs to care about and learn about. So when I saw that Oprah had a book, that was really exciting to me. And so the library has agreed to partner with us, and we have, how many copies?
We have 10 copies of the book available, and then we also have audio, and there's also ebook copies available online. So hopefully we get a lot of people exposure to this book.
So the first thing I want to talk about is typically when I give a program, I work with the CASA program, and so I'm always talking about how we can help abused and neglected kids, and I share case story, and I'm always very careful to not share any details about which family I'm talking about, because there's so much confidentiality. But today, I will share details about a case, but I'll let you know who it was, because it was Oprah. And Oprah shares in the book some of the things that happened to her. And so it's kind of unusual to actually know who it is we're talking about that was facing some childhood adversity. Yay, that works. Okay. In this book, we're going to examine how we can understand ourselves, how we can understand others, all through this lens of childhood adversity and childhood trauma. There are scientific insights on the impact of trauma, and the book also spends a lot of time talking about how to heal from traumatic experiences. And I think that's the really important part. It's like we all have to understand the impact, but then it's like, well, then what are we going to do about that? And so it's really nice because there are key points in here about what really is helpful for this type of thing. You'll notice that the co-author on this book is Dr. Bruce Perry. And Dr. Perry is a child psychologist, and he's also a neuroscientist. So you can imagine if he studies the brain and he studies kids, that he's the perfect person to be talking about how adverse experience impact the developing brain. And of course we know Oprah. Oprah's iconic TV host, and she's a producer, and she's been an actress in movies, and she's a philanthropist. And I think probably everybody on the planet has probably watched the Oprah Winfrey show. And in her show, she interviewed tens of thousands of guests, and a lot of those people were people who were sharing their traumatic experiences that they had had. So Oprah is going to share a little bit about her thoughts on trauma. This book is set up like a conversation between Oprah and Dr. Perry, and how not only do they impact the child, but those systems in the brain then are going to be lifelong, impacting this child as they grow up to be an adult. Stress is a big trigger for the trauma to manifest in ways that are maybe unhelpful. And so it's a problem for society, but it's also a problem for the individual person. So have you ever wondered why you or maybe somebody else reacts a certain way? Or why you or maybe somebody else can't kick that bad habit? I don't know why they can't give up drinking. I don't know why they, whatever, fill in the blank, use drugs, smoke. Do you know anybody, or have you yourself ever been labeled a people pleaser, disruptive, argumentative, bad at relationships, self-sabotager, checked out? There are people who just want to fade into the woodwork. That's a big clue. Too sensitive. I get told this. I used to get told this all the time. You're just too sensitive. Can't hold a job. We all know people like that. All of these things are what gets manifested through some of these traumatic brain structure experiences. So, the whole premise of the title of the book is saying, instead of saying, what's wrong with you, what's the matter with you, which really sends this message of, if somebody's saying what's wrong with you, they're basically saying to you, you are damaged goods. You are flawed in some way. And nobody wants to be, basically called that there's something wrong with them. But shifting that, when somebody has a bad behavior, shifting that to this more compassionate, what happened to you? Or ask yourself, well, what happened to me that I'm acting this way? And as you'll see as we go through, it's not necessarily saying those words, but it's having that compassionate feeling towards somebody about, well, what happened? Think about it. I wonder what happened in their life that's causing this behavior. So our brains are uniquely shaped by experiences, good and bad, that we have during childhood. It says at birth, but even those several months in utero are impacting the development of that baby's brain. And senses are coming at that developing brain. And if I have my statistics right, 20,000 neurons are being processed in the baby's brain every second. In an adult, it's 800. Quite a difference, and you can see why it's super important. What sensory input is going into that brain when it's making that much developing pathways and synapses. So every baby is born basically like with this feeling like I belong here. They try to make sense of their world, and it's only when negative things start happening that they start to alter that feeling of safety and comfort. So, violence in the home, the lack of gentle, soothing voices, lack of touch. Babies need to be touched. And And sometimes I get a little concerned when you see a baby in a carrier, and then you see them carry it, sit down, and then they pick it up and carry it over somewhere else, and until they change a diaper, nobody's holding that baby, and it's like, that really, really is not good. You must, that touch is such a sensory input for positive brain development. So, experiencing abuse, and as in the CASA program, we've had babies who were abused as infants and had broken ribs. It's like so shocking to me, but children can experience abuse almost from the get-go. But what we see most often is severe neglect. And so if a child's needs are being neglected, that is really a stressor and is also affecting that brain development. Okay, we all know who this is. This is little Oprah. And as you can see, she was born in Mississippi. Her parents never married, and I'm going to actually read a couple excerpts from the book about Oprah telling her story. I hope I can read this because, boy, the print is tiny. The most pervasive feeling I remember from my own childhood was loneliness. My mother and father were together only once underneath an old oak tree not far from the house where my mother, Bernita, was raised in Kosciuszko, Mississippi. My father, Vernon, used to tell me that I never would have been born if he hadn't been curious about what was underneath my mother's 8-poodle skirt. 9 months later, I arrived. From the moment I could make sense of it, I knew I was unwanted. My father didn't even know about me until my mother sent him a birth announcement asking for money for baby clothes. My grandmother, Hattie Mae's home, was a place where children were seen but not heard. I had distinct memories of my grandfather shooing me away with his cane, yet no memory of him speaking directly to me. After my grandmother passed away, I was shuttled between my mother, who had moved to Milwaukee, and my father in Nashville. Because I didn't know either one, I struggled to develop strong roots or connections with my parents. My mother worked as a maid for $50 a week in Fox Point on the North Shore of Milwaukee, doing what she could to care for 3 young children. There was no time for mothering. I was always trying not to bother her or worry her. My mother felt distant, cold to the needs of this little girl. All of the energy went to keeping her head above water, to surviving. I always felt like a burden, like an extra mouth to have to feed. I rarely remember feeling loved. From as early as I can remember, I knew I was on my own. And you can almost see it in her face, how sad she feels. She continues on in the book. As a young girl, I was whooped regularly. At the time, it was accepted practice for caregivers to use corporal punishment to discipline a child. My grandmother, Hattie Mae, embraced it, but even at 3 years old, I knew that what I was experiencing was wrong. I was beaten for the slightest reason. Spilled water, a broken glass, the inability to keep quiet or still. Sometimes the whoopings would get saved up for Saturday night when I was naked and freshly bathed. In the powerful words, millions of people were treated just as I was as children and grew up believing that their lives were of no value. Boy, that's a sad statement. One of the main things every person wants is to feel wanted and valued. And little Oprah did not feel that way. The other author of this book is Dr. Bruce Perry. And as you can see, and as I mentioned before, he's a neuroscientist and child psychologist, frequently was on the Oprah Winfrey show, and she interviewed him on 60 Minutes, and he talks about that in this book. In 2018, I sat down with Oprah for a 60-minute story about trauma-informed care. Though only 2 minutes of our conversation ended up in the final segment, millions of people were watching and listening, and the excitement created in the community of professionals working in trauma was remarkable. But there is so much more to say. In the enthusiasm for our conversation, it was in part reflection of Oprah's new enthusiasm for the importance of this topic. On CBS this morning, Oprah told Gayle King that she would dance on tabletops to get people to pay attention to the impact of trauma on the developing brains of children. And if you go on YouTube, you can find that clip, and she says it like 3 times during that interview. Oprah calls this the most important story of her life, that 60 Minutes interview. Oprah has been talking about abuse and neglect and healing for her entire career. Her dedication to educating people about trauma-related topics has been a hallmark of her shows. For 25 years, the Oprah Winfrey Show took a deep and thoughtful look at developmental adversity, challenges, distress, stress, trauma, and resilience. Oprah and Dr. Perry have been talking about trauma, the brain, resilience, and healing for more than 30 years, and this book is in many ways the culmination of those talks. So in chapter 1, how the brain develops from infancy to adulthood, and how the brain receives information and processes information in those early years. And it talks about the basic brain architecture. And you think about, they call it brain architecture for a reason, and that is, you have to have, like when you build a house or building, you have to have a firm, solid foundation. And the brain is like that. And then you have to build up from there. So notice that it's the good and the bad that shapes who we are. We're not saying that every child only experiences good things or every child only experiences bad things. There is, for every child, there is a combination, but obviously, we want the good to far outweigh the bad. So Dr. Perry mentions that he often hears the question, what is wrong with that child? Why are they behaving that way? Or why would somebody abuse that child? And he gets all these why questions. Why is somebody doing that? And so that really shaped his research and wanting to find out what those answers really were. So if you take a look at the model of the brain, it's hard to see from where you are, but it's like a funnel. And as I said, the foundation is the most important, or the first building block that you build on. And the foundation up there is the brainstem at the bottom, and that is what we sometimes think of as our reptilian brain. In other words, it's like it keeps our heart beating, it keeps us breathing, it keeps, our systems going without us having to think about doing that. And it is the first place where sensory input goes. And then as you go up, you're building onto more and more sophisticated brain functions. Ultimately, we want to be operating in our cortex level, where that's where we're doing our thinking and our creating, and we can think of the past and we can hope for the future, and we can communicate, and all of those things. So the model of the brain is, the thing to remember is it builds up, but things come in at the bottom and work their way up for the processing. So he kind of calls this a 4-layered cake, and as things are coming in, they get connected to experiences that were similar. And so it's like, oh, okay, I know what to do here. So it's when new information, something unfamiliar comes in, that there are some stressors. And stress is one of those things that kind of shuts down the progress up to the cortex. So a child all of a sudden walks into a room and sees some domestic violence going on between parents. That sensory input is going to be very scary, and it's going to be a trauma, and they're going to be almost like frozen there or running away, but they're not going to understand how to process it. Number one, they're a child. And number two, the brain is not letting them think any more higher level. It's stuck right there at that brainstem because stress shuts things down. The brain is organized to act before you think, and that is exactly the hierarchy there of the brain. So victims of neglect or abuse or trauma are, those kids are the ones that want to feel needed, but they don't feel needed. They want to feel valued, but they don't feel valued. I mean, how valuable must you be if nobody pays any attention to you to make sure you get something to eat? And so those needs then have to be soothed in other ways. And if they're not addressed, that's when you get into what we call negative coping mechanisms. In other words, all right, I'm going to start feeling needed and valued from maybe things that aren't so good for you. Violence, addiction, all of those labels that we talked about earlier, those are the coping skills that kids have developed. Young children, well, everybody needs to feel balanced in order to feel safe. And when you're out of balance, when stress comes in and you feel out of balance, until you can sort of regain your balance, either by remembering how you handled something before, or, you know, as you grow up and you have experiences, you're not as stressed by something that's brand new and scary, but that puts you out of balance. And so, balance is one of those things that is very rhythmic. And when you think about it, when a baby is fussy, what do? We pick them up and we have this rocking motion. It's very soothing. It puts them back in balance. So when you are raised in a nurturing and supportive and caring environment and you cry, somebody responds to your needs and you get regulated again. Ultimately, you grow up with this loving attention. And the networks in your brain allow you to regulate yourself and connect to people in healthy relationships. That's what we all want to see. But it's important that it's worth a closer look. We have important neural networks in our brains involved in regulation, including our stress response system. We have neural networks that are involved in forming and maintaining relationships. And we have neural networks that are involved in rewards. And so when they're activated, they give us pleasure. So when you have them together, they create our foundational memories. And these are the reasons that we feel regulated and rewarded when we get signals of acceptance or warmth from somebody else. A person's capacity to connect, to be regulating and regulated, to reward and be rewarded, are the glue that keeps families and communities together. When the attentive and responsive adult comes to the crying infant, two important things happen. The baby feels the pleasure at being regulated after being distressed, and also experiences that sight, smell, touch, sound, and movement of human interaction. The loving sensations provided by the adult caregiver start to become associated with pleasure. In thousands of moments when the caregiver responds to the needs of the infant, the brain is connecting relationships to reward and regulation. Furthermore, these bonding experiences create the infant's worldview about humans. A consistent, nurturing caregiver builds an internal view that people are safe, people are predictable, and people are caring. We learn that a connection with another person can be rewarding and regulating, and it pulls us to engage with our teachers, our coaches, our classmates. It usually leads us to more and more positive human interactions. The brain is a meaning-making machine, always trying to make sense of the world. So in that worldview, people are good, and then we will always anticipate good things from people. So you can imagine, with the opposite experiences, you're going to get the opposite results. Being in a high degree of stress is unpredictable. It could be extreme. It could be something you've never experienced before. It could be going on over and over and over again or for a long time. And that makes a person very vulnerable. But if the stress is something predictable and the stress is moderate, we actually grow from those kinds of stress. Picture a little kid going into school for the very first time. That's stressful. But if they have a nurturing teacher and maybe the parent is with them and they are supportive and they realize that, oh, I've heard about this, it was predictable what was going to happen, the teacher told us what we're going to do and that's what we did, then it becomes controllable, and then it is something that builds resilience in that brain. So it's the predictable and the unpredictable that make quite a difference on a person's ability to handle that stress. If the stress response systems are activated in prolonged ways or chaotic ways, or as in cases of abuse or neglect, they become sensitized and dysfunctional. Most people are familiar with the term fight or flight when a stressor arrives. This refers to that set of responses that can kick in when we're afraid. Your brain is going to focus your attention on the potential threat. It's going to shut down any unnecessary processes like thinking in your higher brain. Your sense of time is going to collapse. Your heart rate is going to go up. Send blood to your muscles in preparation, potentially for fleeing or fighting. Adrenaline is pumping through your body. And if you've ever really paid attention to your body when you have something unexpected and kind of scary happen, you do feel your heart just beating a lot faster. And you can feel that adrenaline. This arousal response is not the only way we can respond to a threat, however. Imagine a situation where you're too small to win a fight or you're unable to run away. And in this case, the brain and the rest of the body prepares for injury. Your heart rate goes down. You release your body's own painkiller, which is like an opioid. You disengage from the external world and psychologically flee into your inner world. This is all part of another adaptive capability called disassociation. For babies and very young children, disassociation is a very common adaptive strategy because fighting or fleeing isn't going to protect them, but disappearing might. Over time, your capacity to retreat into that inner world where you're safe, free, and in control increases. A key part of that sensitized ability to disassociate is to be a people pleaser. And if you think about it, this is what Oprah did when she was whooped her grandmother would say, "Don't you dare cry, you put a smile on your face." Well, how's that for, like, I have to smile and I'm in extreme pain. And pretty soon she started to realize what cues to look for and would kind of disappear so that she wouldn't catch the wrath of her grandmother. And then she talks later about becoming quite a people pleaser in her life, to the point of it wasn't a good thing. As I said, that's called dysregulation. And so when Oprah was a young adult, she had already experienced severe neglect, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. And she was trying to overcome those things. She did have some supportive people in her life. She talks often about her teachers being very much her saviors, the people in her life that really made her feel like somebody cares about me. But notice that she was working. Anything anybody asked her to do, she was always there to do it, even though she was wearing herself out. And what was her comfort? How did she kind of calm herself down, self-regulate? She overate, and that's an addiction. And that's how she comforted herself. The main thing to see on this slide, this is a picture from the book, is that when you're calm and functioning at your highest level, your IQ, which is on the bottom, your functional IQ, which is on the bottom, is 120 to 100 IQ points. When you go way to the other end of this chart and you are facing terror, you're in a state of terror, you'll notice that it's your brainstem that's doing the functioning for you, not your cortex. And you go all the way down, and what IQ level are you working at when you're in extreme terror or trauma? 60 to 80 IQ points. That's how much the trauma paralyzes your brain and causes it to just basically not function the way it's supposed to. Okay, so the spectrum of trauma, because for this book we have to really understand brain development, and we have to understand what trauma is before we can get to the point where we're going to say, well, this is what we're going to do about trauma. One of the things that is talked about in this book that hopefully you've heard of, I mentioned it at the beginning, and that is the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And you shorten that up and you say ACEs. And Dr. Perry talks about that. The original Adverse Childhood Experience study was published in 1998. The authors created a simple 10-question questionnaire. And this is actually in the book. 10 questions is all they are. And these are the 10 questions. Before you turned 18, did you have a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you? Give yourself 1 point. Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard you had marks or were injured? If so, give yourself a point. Just do this in your head. Did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you or have you touch their body in a sexual way, or attempt or actually have oral, anal, vaginal intercourse with you? If yes, give yourself 1 point. Obviously, you don't want any points, right? Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? 1 point. Did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, or you had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you, or take you to the doctor if you needed it? If yes, give yourself 1 point. Were your parents ever separated or divorced? Give yourself 1 point. And they've since added a death of a parent in there as well. Was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her? Or sometimes often or very often kicked, beaten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard? Or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or a knife? If the answer is yes, give yourself 1 point. Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? If yes, give yourself 1 point. Was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Yes, 1 point. Did a household member go to prison? Yes, 1 point. Those are the 10 questions. So if you've been keeping track in your mind, you have an ACEs score. 0 is the best you can get, 10 is the worst you can get. And these are, they're not saying how many times, are they? They're saying if you ever experience this even 1 time, you get a point. So obviously, if somebody has, let's say, a 3, but those things only happen once each time, that's probably not as detrimental in their life as somebody who has a 2, but it was chronic, ongoing domestic violence and sexual abuse. So duration makes a difference. Frequency makes a difference. But almost 50% of the children in this country have at least 1 ACE score. Almost every adult has, let me start that over. 25% of adults have at least 3 ACE scores in their ACE score. The higher your score, the more likely you are to have problems with physical or mental health issues. They have connected through scientific study. Higher ACE scores they tend to have more people who have cancer or diabetes or mental health problems like depression or high blood pressure. I mean, there's this whole list of things that are correlated with a high ACE score. Now, be sure you understand that it doesn't mean you're for sure going to have those problems. It just means you're at a higher risk for having those problems. So in the book is the ACE test, if you wanted to review that again. So as I said, the event, the experience that you've had before, and the effects that it has on you are all parts of trauma. Now, think of a burning building. And let's say it's a school. So first graders are in a burning building, or 6th graders are in the burning building, or the teachers are in the burning building, or the firefighters are coming in. Each one of them has a whole different take on what is happening here. And the younger you are, obviously, the less experience you're going to have with these things, and probably the more traumatizing they're going to be. So if somebody would say, well, was that fire traumatizing? Well, sure it was to the 6-year-old. It might have been a little bit to the older kids, but maybe if both of those kids had really supportive parents who really talked about it and comforted them afterwards, maybe they could, get over it, learn it without being too scathed. The firefighter probably thought, hey, this is kind of a fun time. I'll bet you he didn't think it was so traumatic, unless, of course, it was one of those fires where they came across, some very unpleasant things. But all in all, your experience with what the issue of the trauma is going to really determine on your ability and how it's impacting you. So obviously that means that every person processes a trauma differently than everybody else, because we all have different experiences. And we're all probably at different ages, and we all have different supportive backgrounds. So all of those things play into how trauma affects us. But you can see where if you're a person who doesn't have supports, and you haven't had comfort, and you haven't had anybody care about how you're doing, a trauma is gonna impact you a lot more than it would be somebody who has that good foundation. Okay, we're gonna wrap this up by actually hearing from Oprah. She was on CBS this morning, and should be, there we are. Yep.
Experience in one way or another as children can shape our worldview today as adults. It's part of a new book that she co-wrote with psychiatrist Dr. Sherri, and Oprah urges people to flip the question, what's wrong with you, to instead ask, what happened to you? I recently had a chance to speak with both of them about how these old traumas affect us, and more importantly, what we can do now to fix ourselves. Take a look.
So ever since I dipped into what happened to you, the book we're here to discuss, I've been looking at everybody on the street as a former newborn, in your phrase, Oprah.
Yes.
That really gets to what the title represents, a reframing of how we look at one another. It's subtle, but it's very profound, Oprah.
It's subtle, but profound and powerful. And what you're experiencing, Tony, is what I experienced a couple of years ago doing a piece for 60 Minutes. Dr. Bruce Perry and I were talking about childhood trauma, and in that 60 Minutes interview, he said the most important question is not what's wrong with you, which is what most people who are taking care of children who have had, behavioral issues ask. What's wrong with this kid? But the most important question is what happened to this child? And something went, whoa, inside me, and I got it in a way that I hadn't really understood in all the years I've been talking about trauma.
Trauma is a big word, Dr. Perry, but a large portion of the population, if you reflect on it, has experienced something in their life that could be defined under that big word, trauma. Could you talk a little bit about how broad the population is that's affected by these issues?
One of the things that we're learning more and more about is that the stress response systems we have in our body will be altered. And that pattern can be something that comes from a big event, like witnessing a school shooting or a natural disaster, or it can come from accumulated small, unpredictable, uncontrollable stressors, like what will happen with a child who is living in an environment where they're in the out group. They're not the right skin color, they don't have the right gender identity, and when we look at the number of people who have that, it's well over 40% of the population has some significant developmental adversity that puts them at risk.
Each of us creates a unique worldview shaped by our life's experiences, and most of that comes, that worldview, as you now read the book, understand, that worldview is shaped when you are a child. So most people think, Tony, I think that if you're in a bad relationship and your children are hearing things and it's destructive and dysfunctional, that the children will get over it and be resilient, when in fact you are doing the most damage the younger your children are. And those first 2 months are the most critical.
That's when the messages are coming through. The very same part of the brain that's learning language is also learning lessons in trauma, not the right lessons. But the good news, and I can't let either one of you go before we touch on the hopeful side of this, which is once you understand the script that led to you today, what happened to you, you can rewrite that script. And it doesn't mean years, although it can take the work of a lifetime. It can be done with small interventions.
Well, one of the things I asked in the 60 Minutes interview, why aren't I stone crazy? Consider how I was raised. Why don't I have more problems? And one of the things you said to me, Bruce, is that your relationships with teachers, your relationships with people who cared about you, other than your family members. So it just means having somebody who sees you, fully sees and recognizes you, and you can connect to that, changes the way you view yourself and view the world. And that's why what happened to you is so important to all of us.
In other words, it's love, Dr. Perry, but that love can come in small doses. It can be a few focused minutes. Your phone is put down, you're paying attention. It can be an hour-long lunch with a friend. It can be a phone call, a text message.
Absolutely. And all of those things are examples of the kind of therapeutic experience that can be provided by people who are not therapists. And so healing really comes from these moments where people are present, attentive, attuned, and truly see you, as Oprah says.
Well, the book is 300 pages that has grown out of 30 years of conversation and work between the two of you, a lifetime of experience as people and as professionals, and I hope people pick it up.
Thanks, Tony.
You know what I thought was interesting about the book is how trauma affects you at such a young age, like
Yeah.
a 2-month-old. Because I always remember that saying, everything I ever learned in kindergarten, or you're fully
Yeah.
formed by the time you're
Yeah.
6.
Yeah.
That's just not true.
One
That's not true.
of the things I thought was powerful about this book is it obviously helps with people dealing with their own trauma, but it also helps with forgiveness. Because
Yes.
we all have someone in our family who we're like, geez, that person is tough.
Yeah.
And if you stop asking what's wrong with that person, and
Yeah.
you start asking the question of what happened to them, to understand is the first step toward forgiveness.
Well, and the point is, some of these traumas, as you pointed out, can be quite small. They're not necessarily,
Yes.
you think of a trauma as, a
That's
car
right.
crash or something.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be that big. And so much of what we do later in life is actually a reaction to what we felt in
Yeah.
those early moments.
It's amazing the stuff that you carry within
Yeah.
yourself. Yeah. And human connection, as we all know, is so important.
Does anybody have any questions? Are any of you in a book club that might want to take this book on? Because that would be a great, I think, discussion for a book club. Oh, gotta go back
Sorry, I
up.
think we're fighting each other on here.
Okay,
So I just wanted to thank you guys all for coming today, for being willing to have this conversation. Thank you to Sherri for sharing everything that you shared with us today. And just to let you know, we did record today's session so that people can go back and view it again later if you want to, or if someone was not able to come today, that they could view it. We will not be recording when we meet again on April 18th, so that we can have really open conversations, so that we have a safe space, and so that we can protect privacy if anything sensitive comes up. So I wanted you guys to be aware of that. And I think Sherri talked about too, everybody kind of understands trauma is not a good thing, but I think we kind of want to have conversations about what can we do to help others in our lives kind of build up more resilience and more coping, and possibly, give you guys a chance to reflect and process some of the things that may have happened to you and how you internalize those things and react. So that's kind of our goal for the next meeting on April 18th. And there's a very long discussion guide that's 74 pages long. We cut it down to, I think there's like 28 pages here. And it's like reflection questions as you go, so they might kind of help you to guide what we're gonna talk about next time. And there's also coloring pages in there, so it's not all homework, there's a little.
coloring is one of those things that balances you out, and gets you back to calm.
So if you would like to take a hard copy of this with you today, you can certainly do that. And then we have books available and also a sign-in sheet that we're asking for your email address. So if you put your email on there, we can send you the full discussion guide in case you want to. There's more coloring pages, there's more kind of guided suggestions to go through the book. So does anybody have any questions about any of that or any comments?
When we come back on the 18th, do we return the books back in, or can we like write them, or they?
So they are library books, so we'll have to have them returned. But then the 10 books will be available as a book club bag. So if at a later time you would wanna bring it, to a book club or to coworkers or something like that for a book discussion, you can do that. But these copies are for library purposes. And like I said, some of you may have missed this, but we do have ebooks available on Libby, and we have an audiobook here on CD as well. So, do you remember how much they were on Amazon?
On Amazon, it seems to me it was less than $10.
Yeah.
And that's a hardcover book.
If you have Kindle Unlimited from Amazon, I think it's one of the books
guides up here and books, so if you don't have any other questions, we can get those handed out.
And then the sign-up sheet. We also can send you an email reminder